All right, let's jump right in. Today we're diving deep into a listener request. We're going back in time to explore the world of Napoleonic warfare.
A fascinating period for sure.
Definitely. We've got some solid sources to guide us, too. Um, First up, Dodge T. Napoleon, A History of the Art of War, Volume 1. It was published back in 1904,
Ah, a classic.
for sure. And we're also diving into Robert's A. Napoleon the Great from 2014, a more modern take.
Yeah, having both will be great. Dodge gives us that deep dive into, well, the art of war as it was then, tactics and how armies were organized back then.
Right, structure and all that.
And then Roberts gives us a more personal look at Napoleon.
Yeah, a more personal, like a more intimate view of the man himself.
Exactly.
So before we get to Napoleon himself, let's set the scene. Like, what was going on with European armies around the late 1700s, early 1800s?
Well, it was a time of huge changes, really. Dodge describes how European armies were, well, they were struggling to adapt to, the changing times.
Makes sense. Times change, warfare changes.
Exactly.
So what kind of struggles are we talking about here?
Well, at the beginning of the French Revolution, the French army was severely under-resourced.
Oh, wow.
Soldiers were armed, and I'm not kidding here, with pikes.
Pikes. Really?
Yeah, or even just farm tools.
No way. So they're marching into battle with like pitchforks and scythes.
It's hard to imagine, right?
Yeah, that's wild.
Yeah.
But I guess when you're that desperate, you get creative.
That's what they did. This lack of proper weapons and resources, it forced the French to get creative, to adapt. And this led to, over time, a shift to more standardized weapons. And, they started creating specialized units like light infantry and riflemen.
Oh, interesting. So like they had to specialize because they couldn't just equip everyone the same way.
Exactly.
Fascinating how necessity breeds innovation, I guess.
Oh, sure.
So we've got these new types of units emerging. But what about the overall structure of the army? Did that change too?
Absolutely. Dodge talks about the rise of this new unit called the Half Brigade.
Half brigade.
Yeah, it was essentially combining two smaller regiments into one.
Okay. Why do that?
Well, it allowed for a lot more flexibility on the battlefield and better coordination between units.
Oh, I see. So they were moving away from those big clunky formations, like you said, and towards something more adaptable.
Exactly. And it wasn't just the structure that was changing. Tactics had to change too. You know that old cordon system where armies would spread out in long lines trying to hold territory?
Yeah. I've seen that in the old war movies.
Right. So that was gradually being replaced. Armies were starting to use more mobile and aggressive tactics.
Oh, interesting. Like what kinds of tactics?
Well, think open order formations, where soldiers are spread out in looser lines instead of, packed together shoulder to shoulder.
Okay.
That allowed for more speed and maneuverability. And instead of just staying in static lines, they started using columns and squares.
For attack.
Exactly. It allowed them to concentrate their force, hit harder at specific points.
So it became less about holding a fixed position and more about fluidity and sort of targeted strikes.
You got it. And the shift in thinking, it was huge, especially because it fit perfectly with Napoleon's approach to warfare.
Oh, so Napoleon wasn't just some brilliant military mind who came out of nowhere. He was working at a time when the whole nature of warfare was being redefined.
Exactly. He didn't just invent these new tactics and structures. He saw the potential and used them masterfully.
I see. He was the right man at the right time. So we've got this changing military landscape, right?
Right.
But what about Napoleon himself? What kind of person was he? What drove him to become this master of war?
That's where Robert's biography really helps. Through anecdotes and letters, we start to see the man behind the legend, so to speak. For example, Roberts talks about Napoleon's time as a military student. He was dedicated, ambitious. You could see even then that he wanted to excel. He really thirsted for knowledge.
Oh, wow. So even back then, there were hints of the leader he would become.
Right. But Roberts also gives us these glimpses into Napoleon's personal life, It adds to our understanding of him. We read about his love for Josephine, his anxieties about leadership. We learn about his deep sense of family loyalty.
Oh, interesting. So it's a reminder that even the most famous figures in history, they're still human beings, right? With their own emotions, their own doubts.
Absolutely. And understanding that human side can help us understand their actions, their motivations, their impact on the world.
I see. Gives us a more complete picture. Okay, so we've got Napoleon. Brilliant military mind, a complex individual, operating in a time of great change. But what about the soldiers fighting under him? What was their experience like?
That's a question we don't always think about, but Roberts gives us some powerful insights from firsthand accounts. We hear about soldiers enduring these grueling marches. Often they didn't have enough supplies, proper clothing, they faced terrible weather, and of course, they were the ones facing those new tactics and weapons we talked about.
Right. It's kind of sobering when you think about it, especially since, some of them started out with basically farm tools.
It really puts things in perspective. It shows the human cost of war,
Yeah.
behind all those big strategies and battles, and it shows us why those primary sources, those letters and memoirs are so important. They give us a more grounded view of history.
So we've got this evolving military landscape, a glimpse into Napoleon's complex character, a reminder of the human cost of war. Now let's talk about the bigger question, the legacy. Was Napoleon a brilliant strategist, a ruthless tyrant, or a bit of both?
Ugh, that's the question, isn't it? Historians still debate this.
And I'm guessing our sources have something to say about it.
They do. You see, on one hand, Napoleon's military brilliance is undeniable. He completely revolutionized military organization with something called the Corps system.
Core system.
Yeah, it divided armies into smaller, self-sufficient units so they could operate independently.
So instead of one massive force, he had these smaller, more agile units that could adapt faster.
Precisely. And this, combined with his focus on decisive action, concentrating forces at the right moment, well, it was incredibly effective.
Yeah, makes sense. So Napoleon was a big believer in striking hard and fast.
Absolutely. And we even have some of his own words on leadership and strategy.
Oh, right. From Napoleon in his own words, right. I remember seeing that on the reading list.
Right. It gives us a fascinating look into, well, his military thinking, his philosophy of command.
Sounds like a must-read for any aspiring military strategist.
But then there's the other side of the coin, the darker side of his rule.
You're talking about his reputation as a tyrant.
Exactly. Both Dodge and Roberts acknowledge that Napoleon used some, well, let's say unsavory tactics. Political maneuvering, suppressing anyone who disagreed with him, and even sometimes outright brutality.
So there were definitely some shadows in his leadership.
There were. The execution of the Duc d'Enghien, a political rival, is often pointed to as an example of his ruthlessness.
So he was a complex figure, capable of great brilliance, but also prone to darker impulses. How do we reconcile those two sides?
That's where the real challenge of history lies, trying to understand the nuances, the context of his actions, the complexity of his legacy. Was he a product of his time, operating within the harsh realities of early 19th century politics? Or did his ambition lead him down a darker path?
Tough questions.
Ah.
It seems like there are no easy answers, no simple labels we can put on him.
And that's what makes studying this period so fascinating. It pushes us to think critically, to consider different viewpoints, to wrestle with the ambiguities of history.
It's a good reminder that history isn't just dates and battles. It's about trying to understand real people, people who were brilliant and flawed, people who shaped the world in ways that are, well, sometimes contradictory.
Absolutely. And as we dig deeper into these sources, you'll see that the story of Napoleon and his time is as complex as it is captivating. One thing about Napoleon that we don't always hear about,
What's that?
it's his personal life. People always focus on the battles and the politics.
Yeah, all the conquering and whatnot.
Right, exactly. But Roberts, he really dives into Napoleon's relationship with Josephine. And wow, it was a passionate, dramatic romance.
Oh, tell me more.
Well, Napoleon's letters to Josephine, they're full of these intense declarations of love and longing. He even gets jealous.
Oh, that's kind of cute.
Yeah, imagine, right, this guy, he's out conquering nations, but then he's pouring his heart out in these letters, worrying about what Josephine's doing back home.
So even Napoleon, Emperor of France, had a soft spot.
It's true, and Roberts tells this one story. It happened during the Italian campaign.
Okay, what happened?
Napoleon was away, right? And these rumors start flying around about Josephine.
Oh, no. Rumors of what?
Infidelity.
Ouch.
Yeah, and Napoleon, he was furious. He even threatened to divorce her.
Wow, so even the great Napoleon wasn't immune to heartbreak.
Nope, not at all. But here's the interesting part.
Okay.
Despite being so angry, Napoleon eventually forgave Josephine.
Huh. Why do you think he did that?
Some historians think it was, well, partly political. You see, as Napoleon's ambitions grew, having a stable marriage, especially to someone like Josephine with her connections, it became really important for his image.
Ah, so it was like a mix of love and political strategy.
It's hard to say for sure, but it makes you wonder, how much of his personal life was truly personal and how much was calculated.
Yeah, that's a good question. It's like
Yeah.
you can analyze the actions, read the letters, but we'll never really know what was going on in his head.
That's the mystery of history, isn't
Got it.
it?
It is. So we talked about his love life. What about his family? Did they play a role in his rise to power?
Oh, absolutely. Both Dodge and Roberts talk about how important family loyalty was to Napoleon. He really relied on his siblings. He appointed them to all these important positions in the government and the military.
So it's kind of like a family business.
In a way, yeah. But, not everyone was happy about it.
I can imagine. Giving your siblings all the best jobs,
Hmm.
that's got to rub some people the wrong way.
It did. People felt like they were being overlooked. And to be honest, not all of Napoleon's siblings were, well, let's say, qualified.
Oh, really?
Yeah. Take Joseph, for example. Napoleon made him king of Naples and then later king of Spain. But he really struggled. He constantly needed Napoleon's help.
Oh, man. So even with good intentions, even Napoleon could make mistakes.
It happens. It shows that even with all his brilliance, he could let personal loyalty cloud his judgment.
Yeah, I guess nobody's perfect.
That's for sure. Speaking of interesting figures, one guy we should talk about is Archduke Charles of Austria.
Oh, yeah.
Hmm.
He was one of Napoleon's biggest rivals.
Exactly. And a really skilled commander. Roberts describes him as this brilliant strategist, a real leader. He knew how to inspire his troops.
Sounds like a worthy opponent.
He was. In fact, Roberts even suggests that Charles was the only enemy general that Napoleon truly respected.
Wow, high praise. But if he was so good, how come Napoleon ended up on top?
Well, Charles had to deal with a lot of political interference. The Habsburg court, they would sometimes dictate his strategy, limit his resources.
Ah, so he had all these people looking over his shoulder, second-guessing him.
It was tough. Napoleon, on the other hand, had a lot more freedom to act on his own.
So it wasn't just about being a good general. It was about navigating those political waters, too.
Exactly, and that was a pattern throughout Napoleon's career. He was brilliant at exploiting his enemies' weaknesses, both on the battlefield and in the political arena. But, there's one area where Napoleon consistently struggled:
Hey, was that?
naval power.
Ah, right. He could conquer land, but not the sea.
It's true. Both Dodge and Roberts talk about his difficulties in challenging British dominance at sea.
The British Navy was a force to be reckoned with back then.
They were the best. And Napoleon, even though he recognized the importance of naval power, he could never quite overcome them.
What was his biggest defeat at sea? Wasn't it Trafalgar?
Yep. Trafalgar, 1805. That was a crushing defeat. It basically ended his hopes of invading England. After that, he had to focus on continental campaigns.
I see. So it's like that saying, man can conquer the world, but he can't conquer the sea.
Huh. That's a good one. And that inability to control the seas, it played a big part in Napoleon's downfall.
Really? How so?
Well, the British blockade, it cut off trade routes, it crippled the French economy, and that led to a lot of unrest among the French people.
So even with all his military genius and political skills, in the end, geography and economics caught up with him.
They did. It's a good lesson. Even the most powerful leaders are still limited by their circumstances.
Yeah. But even so, Napoleon's impact on Europe, on the world, it was huge.
Oh, absolutely. No doubt about it.
Okay, so we've talked about his personal life, his family, his rivals, his struggles at sea. It's clear he was a complex guy.
For sure.
But what about his long-term impact?
Mm-mm.
How did all these Napoleonic wars reshape Europe? Politically, socially, all of it.
That's where things get really interesting. It's where we really see Napoleon's legacy unfold.
Okay, so fill me in. What were some of the biggest lasting consequences of these wars?
Well, for one thing, Napoleon's conquests actually spread the ideals of the French Revolution.
Really? Ironic, considering he ended up emperor.
It is. But think about it. Liberty, equality, popular sovereignty, all those ideas,
Yeah.
they weren't just contained to France anymore.
They spread to the conquered territories.
Exactly. They started taking root in other nations, challenging the old ways of doing things, inspiring people to push for change.
So, in a way, Napoleon accidentally became this revolutionary figure.
Huh. Yeah, you could say that. He saw himself as this builder of empires. But without realizing it, he was setting in motion the very forces that would, well, dismantle empires.
Fascinating. He really shaped the future without meaning to. It's a good reminder that actions have unintended consequences, right?
Absolutely. And it wasn't just about spreading ideas. There was another big consequence of these wars: nationalism.
Nationalism.
As Napoleon's armies marched all over Europe, they often met resistance from the local populations.
Oh, I bet.
And that resistance, it sparked this sense of shared identity. People started seeing themselves as nations united against a common enemy.
So Napoleon was trying to create a French-dominated Europe, but he ended up giving people a reason to, well, to resist that domination, to define themselves as something different.
It's true. He basically fueled the very forces that would eventually challenge him. And that rise of nationalism, it had a huge impact on Europe. In the 19th century, the 20th century, it led to new nation states. It fueled conflicts over, well, over identity and territory.
So Napoleon's wars had this really complicated legacy, right? They led to these political and social upheavals, but did they also change military thinking itself?
Oh, absolutely. Remember how we talked about Napoleon being a military innovator?
Yeah, the core system and all that.
Right. His ideas, not just about strategy, but also organization and logistics, they were hugely influential on how warfare developed.
So even though his empire crumbled, his military ideas, they lived on.
Exactly. And you know, one of the most interesting parts of his military legacy,
What's that?
it's how he changed the role of the general.
Yeah.
Before Napoleon, generals were often these aristocratic figureheads leading from a distance.
Right.
But Napoleon, he was involved in everything, from planning the battles to rallying his troops on the front lines.
So he was a true leader, leading by example.
Exactly. And that hands-on approach, combined with his charisma, his decisiveness, it set a new standard. You know, it's still studied today in military academies.
Wow. So even though he lost at Waterloo, his impact on military strategy, on leadership, it's still felt today.
Definitely. There's no denying his impact.
This has been an incredible deep dive. We've explored Napoleon's life, his legacy, his wins, his losses.
And we've seen how he really left his mark on the world in ways he probably never imagined.
Yeah, it's a good reminder that history isn't just about dates and battles. It's about people. Complex people like Napoleon.
Well said. And that's what makes it so fascinating.
Absolutely. So for everyone listening, keep exploring this era, read those primary sources, and come to your own conclusions about Napoleon. Until next time, keep learning, keep questioning, and keep diving deep.